Grab me, Bruce Lee said. The room went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being respectful, the held, airless quiet of people who have just realized they are about to witness something they will spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. The man across from him weighed 310 pounds. He was not soft weight, not the comfortable mass of a man who has let himself go. He was a professional wrestler, a legitimate one, with a legitimate career. A man who had spent 15 years learning how to take other large men and fold them against their will into positions their bodies were not designed for. He had thrown men who outweighed Bruce Lee by 150 pounds. He had pinned state champions. He had broken holds that most practitioners believed were unbreakable. He looked at Bruce Lee, 135 pounds, standing in a plain shirt with his arms loose at his sides, and he almost smiled. Almost. Because something in the room had changed when Lee spoke those two words. Something in the air. And some part of this man, the part that 15 years of serious competition had trained to read danger before the mind caught up, felt it. He grabbed anyway. 6 seconds later, he deeply regretted it. This is what happened. To understand what Bruce Lee walked into that afternoon, you need to understand what professional wrestling was in 1968. Not what it became, not the choreographed spectacle that it evolved into. What it was then, in its serious and largely private form. A combat system of genuine and devastating effectiveness, practiced by men who understood leverage and body mechanics at a level that most martial artists never approached. Catch wrestling, the discipline that underpinned the serious end of the profession, was old, older than most martial arts systems that carried themselves with more ceremony. It came from Lancashire and Iowa and the mining camps of the industrial North, places where men settled arguments with their bodies, and the arguments were real. It had no kata, no forms, no philosophical literature. It had results. A trained catch wrestler understood the human skeleton the way a carpenter understands wood, its grain, its tolerances, the exact angles at which it would hold and the exact angles at which it would fail. They understood how to use an opponent's weight against him, how to make size irrelevant by positioning, how to take a man twice their own mass and reduce him to compliance through the application of mechanical advantage. They were, in the honest assessment of anyone who understood fighting, extremely dangerous. And in 1968, in Los Angeles, the most respected practitioner of this discipline in the region was a man named Ivan Keller. Ivan Keller. The name means nothing now. It meant something then. He was 40 years old in 1968, 6'2", 310 pounds at his competition weight, which meant that the 310 pounds was not incidental, it was engineered. He had maintained that weight through 15 years of professional competition the way a surgeon maintains his instruments, with precision, with purpose, with the understanding that the tool is only as good as the care invested in it. He had begun wrestling at 19 in Ohio, had gone professional at 22, had competed across the Midwest and the West Coast in the circuits that existed before the sport's transformation into entertainment. He had won more than he had lost. He had lost to men he respected and had learned from every loss with the methodical seriousness of someone who treats defeat as data. By 1968, he had retired from active competition and was running a training facility in the Inglewood area, a serious gym by the standards of the time, not a public fitness center, a working space for practitioners, with a wrestling mat that covered most of the floor, weights along one wall, and the particular smell of a room where people have been working hard for a long time. He taught. He trained younger wrestlers. He maintained his own conditioning with the discipline of someone who cannot imagine existing without it. And he had opinions about Bruce Lee. The opinions had been forming for a year. He'd heard the stories, the one-inch punch at Long Beach, the private demonstrations, the growing legend of a man who moved too fast for the eye to follow. He had processed these stories with the skepticism of someone who has spent 15 years in a profession where exaggeration is the native currency. Speed, in his experience, was overrated. Speed was what people talked about when they didn't understand leverage. A fast man was still a man, still subject to the same physics, still possessing the same joints that bent and the same weight that could be redirected. You didn't need to be faster than your opponent. You needed to get hold of him. Once you had hold of him, speed became irrelevant. He was not dismissive of Bruce Lee out of ignorance. He had done his research. He had spoken to people who had trained with Lee, seen him work, felt what he was capable of. He acknowledged the striking ability. He acknowledged the speed. He simply believed with the settled certainty of long experience that none of it would matter once a man of his size had secured a grip. The grip was everything. And he was certain, absolutely professionally certain, that no one weighing 135 pounds could prevent a man of his size from securing a grip if he truly committed to obtaining one. He made this opinion known, not publicly, not in a manner designed for maximum visibility, but in the circles he moved in, to the peoples whose respect he valued. He said clearly, the Lee demonstrations were impressive against untrained opponents. Against a serious grappler, the physics were simply not on his side. The word traveled. It always traveled. The meeting was arranged by a man named Robert Chow, no relation to David Chow of our earlier story, though the martial arts world of late 60s Los Angeles was small enough that most of these connective threads ran through the same handful of people. Robert Chow was a trainer, a connector, a man who moved between the striking arts and the grappling arts with the easy fluency of someone who had studied both seriously and respected both honestly. He knew Keller from years of parallel work in the combat sports community. He knew Lee from training sessions and demonstrations. He brought the message from Keller's side to Lee's attention on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1968. Keller's position was framed as a technical question, a genuine one, Chow insisted, not a challenge in the aggressive sense. A question about how Lee's methods addressed the grappling problem. Specifically, what happened when a man of serious size and grappling experience committed fully to securing a clinch? How did the system respond to that? It was genuinely a good question, one of the best questions anyone had brought to Lee. Lee listened to the full message before responding. Then he said, "Tell him Saturday morning, his gym." Chow said, "You sure you want to go to his space?" Lee looked at him. Chow didn't ask again. Saturday morning arrived gray and mild, the October air carrying the first suggestion of something cooler beneath the usual warmth. Lee arrived at the Inglewood gym at 9 in the morning with Dan Inosanto, the same student who had accompanied him to the Burbank boxing gym 3 years earlier, who had by now accumulated enough experience of these situations to arrive with the particular calm of someone who trusts entirely in what he is about to witness. The gym was already occupied. Keller had assembled 7 people, not a crowd, a selection. 4 of his serious students, men who had trained under him for years, 2 fellow practitioners from affiliated schools, and Robert Chow himself, who had arranged the meeting and whose presence was understood by everyone as a form of neutral witness. Keller stood at the center of the mat. Seeing him in his space was different from hearing about him. This was what Lee registered first, and registered completely. The specific gravity of a man in his own environment, surrounded by people who had learned what they knew from him on a surface he had trained on for years. He was large in a way that the numbers, 310 pounds, didn't fully capture. He had the density of someone whose mass has been organized by serious athletic purpose over a long period of time. He stood on the mat with the comfort of someone for whom this surface was the most natural ground in the world. He looked at Bruce Lee. He said, "Smaller than I expected." Lee said, "Most things worth understanding are." Keller almost smiled. Not quite. He said, "You know what I do." Lee said, "I do." Keller said, "Then you know that speed doesn't matter once I have my hands on you." Lee nodded, a slow, genuine nod, not conceding the point, acknowledging that he had heard it. He said, "That's the right question. Let's see what the answer is." The mat cleared. Keller's students moved to the edges of the room. Chow positioned himself near the weight rack with the careful neutrality of a man who intends to see everything and interpret nothing until later. The two men faced each other in the center of the mat. The size difference was, there is no other word for it, extreme. Keller outweighed Lee by 175 pounds. He was 6 inches taller. His arms, extended, could reach across a distance that Lee's shorter frame would have to cross entirely before making contact. His hands, and this detail was noted specifically by one of the students who recounted the morning years later, were enormous. The hands of someone who had spent 15 years closing them around things and not letting go. He stood in a slight crouch, weight forward, arms extended and angled downward, the classic entry position of an experienced grappler waiting for the moment to shoot for a clinch. Everything about his posture said, "I am going to get hold of you. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when." Lee stood opposite. Same non-stance, same loose, even, non-announcing presence. He looked at Keller's hands, his feet, his shoulders. He read the posture the way a reader reads a sentence, quickly, completely, extracting meaning that someone less trained would miss. One of the students along the wall would say later, watching Lee look at Keller was like watching someone read a map of a place they had already been. The room held its breath. Keller shifted his weight slightly forward. Lee said, "Grab me."
Keller moved, not tentatively, not with the exploratory caution of a man testing unfamiliar territory. He moved with the full, committed force of someone who has decided that hesitation is the only real enemy, that the only way to lose this exchange is to not be decisive enough at the beginning of it. He shot forward. In wrestling terms, it was a double-leg takedown entry, his 210 pounds of upper body dropping low, his massive arms driving outward to encircle Lee's legs, his legs driving from the mat with the explosive force of 15 years of trained muscle memory. It was, executed at this weight and with this precision, one of the most physically overwhelming movements in unarmed combat. He had used it to take down men who outweighed Bruce Lee by 150 pounds. He had never missed it when he truly committed. He missed it. Not because Lee ran, not because Lee jumped back or spun away or created distance. Lee did something that none of the 7 witnesses were fully able to reconstruct afterward in consistent terms. He moved with the shot rather than away from it, a lateral and downward shift so precisely timed that Keller's driving arms found the geometry of a body that was no longer organized the way he had aimed at. The grip that was supposed to be everything, closed on air. 310 pounds of committed momentum with nothing to hold. 1 second. Keller recovered. This is important, and the witnesses were consistent on this point. He recovered fast. With the speed of genuine athletic experience, he adjusted, redirected, found his feet, and turned toward Lee with his arms already resetting for the second attempt. He was good. He was very, very good. It didn't matter, because in the time it took Keller to recover and reset, a recovery that by any objective measure was fast, that any experienced combat sports observer would have called impressive, Bruce Lee had moved twice. The first movement put him beside Keller's right shoulder at an angle that closed the distance without entering the range of the grappling arms. The second movement was a strike. Not a full committed punch, something more specific and more devastating, a palm heel delivered to a precise point on Keller's shoulder joint, the force not blunt but angular, designed not to damage but to rotate, to take the shoulder and turn it in a direction the body would follow involuntarily. The body followed. 2 seconds. Keller went down to one knee. Not thrown, not swept, taken there by the logic of his own skeleton, his shoulder rotating, his weight shifting to compensate, his knee finding the mat as the natural response to a direction of travel his legs had not chosen. He was on one knee for less than half a second. He came back up immediately, the reflexive, trained response of a wrestler for whom the mat is familiar ground, for whom being taken down is not a conclusion, but a transition. He reached for Lee as he rose. His right hand, that enormous, trained 15-year hand, found Lee's left wrist. He closed it. He had the grip. For one fraction of 1 second, Ivan Keller had what he had said was all he needed. 3 seconds. What happened next is the part of the story that the witnesses found most difficult to explain. Not because it was invisible, it wasn't. Not because it happened too fast to see, some of it they saw clearly. It was difficult to explain because the sequence of events that followed from Keller securing his grip ran precisely and completely contrary to everything their experience told them should happen when a 310-pound grappler closes his hand around a smaller man's wrist. The grip should have been the end of the story. It was the beginning of the end of Keller's. Lee did not pull against the grip, did not try to break it with force, which would have been, against a hand that strong, futile. He moved into it, toward Keller, not away from him, closing the distance that the grappler needed to generate leverage, making himself too close to be controlled by the extended arm, too inside the geometry for the grip to mean what it was supposed to mean. And then he did something with his free right hand that happened, by the account of Chow, who was watching from the closest neutral position, in a window of time he estimated at less than 1/4 of a second. A strike to the inside of Keller's right elbow, precise, targeted not at the muscle, but at the nerve cluster beneath it, the specific point where, if contacted with the right angle and the right force, the signal from the brain to the hand is interrupted. Not permanently, not with damage, for long enough. Keller's grip released. 4 seconds. The release was involuntary. That detail mattered enormously to everyone in the room, and it mattered most to Keller himself, standing in the center of his own mat, looking at his right hand as if it had betrayed him. Because his hand had not been defeated by strength, it had not been pried open or overpowered, it had simply stopped working. For 1 or 2 seconds, the connection between his intention and his hand had been severed by a man who knew exactly where to cut it. He shook his hand once. The feeling returned. That was how the nerve strike worked, a temporary interruption rather than damage. He looked at Lee. His face showed something specific and private. Not anger, not embarrassment, but the expression of a man who has just discovered that the territory he thought he understood completely has an entire region on it he never knew existed. He breathed. He set himself again. He came forward for the 3rd time, this time differently. Not the committed, decisive shot of the first attempt, something more careful, something that acknowledged for the first time that the man across from him had information he needed to account for. 5 seconds.
Lee was already moving. He circled right, a small, efficient arc, staying just at the edge of Keller's extended reach, making the larger man rotate to track him. And as Keller rotated, as his weight shifted to his left foot to complete the turn, Lee did something that the students along the wall would discuss for years. He stopped moving. For one full beat, one moment of complete stillness, he simply stood. And Keller, committed to the tracking rotation, his weight already transferred, his momentum already engaged in a direction, walked directly into a single compact right-hand strike to the solar plexus. Not a full extension punch, not the dramatic committed blow of a fighting movie. Something almost small, almost intimate, 2 inches of travel. The entire force of it generated not from the arm, but from the hip rotation and the body mechanics of a man who had spent years learning how to produce maximum force from minimal visible movement. Keller stopped. 6 seconds. He stood completely still. His arms dropped to his sides. His eyes, and this detail appears in every account from every witness in the room, went briefly unfocused, not with pain, but with the specific neurological response of a solar plexus strike landing perfectly, the temporary involuntary suspension of the body's normal operation. His breath left him. He took one step back. Then he sat down. Not fell, sat, with the deliberate, controlled movement of a man choosing to place himself on the mat rather than fall onto it. His large frame settling slowly, his right hand coming to the mat surface, his left hand resting on his own knee. He sat on his mat in his gym in front of his students. And for a long moment, he said nothing. The room was absolutely, completely silent. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the mat. He had not moved significantly from where he started. His breathing was normal. His shirt was barely disturbed. His hands were at his sides, relaxed, the same loose presence they always carried. He looked at Keller on the mat. Not with triumph, not with the performed magnanimity of a smaller man who had just toppled a giant and wants credit for the poetry of it. With something simpler and more genuine, a kind of respect for the size of what Keller had brought to the exchange, and a recognition of what it cost a man like this to be sitting where he was sitting. One of the students along the wall, the youngest one, a 19-year-old who had been training with Keller for 8 months, later said that the moment he remembered most from that morning was not the exchange itself. It was Bruce Lee's face in the 30 seconds after the exchange. He said, "Most people, if they'd just done what he did, would have looked around to see if people were impressed. He didn't look around. He just looked at Keller. Like the only person in the room that mattered to him right then was the man sitting on the mat." Robert Chow moved from his position near the weight rack. He crossed to the center of the mat and stood between the two men, not intervening, simply present, bearing witness in the formal sense. Keller looked up at Lee from the mat. He said, "Do it again." Lee looked at him for a moment. Then he extended his hand. Keller took it, the large hand closing around Lee's offered grip, and Lee helped him to his feet. Not a gesture that cost Lee anything physically, a gesture that understood what it meant to a man like Keller to accept help standing up in his own gym. They faced each other again, and for the next 2 hours, on that mat in Inmilwood on a gray October morning, with 7 witnesses who barely breathed and barely spoke, Bruce Lee showed Yvonne Keller everything. Not to defeat him, not to prove a point that had already been proven, because Keller had asked, because the man sitting on the mat, this serious, proud, legitimate practitioner who had spent his life around a set of skills and a set of beliefs about what those skills could accomplish, had looked up at Lee, and instead of anger, instead of excuses, instead of the defensive machinery that most people deploy when reality contradicts their model of it, had said 2 words, "Do it again." And those 2 words to Bruce Lee were everything. Nobody authorized the story. Keller didn't speak about it publicly, not because he was ashamed, but because what had happened that morning was, in his understanding, private. A private education, the kind that happens between serious practitioners and belongs to them. His students talked, quietly, carefully, with the discretion of people who understood that the story they were carrying was unusual and deserved to be handled with care. But it traveled. Within a month, fragments of it had reached gyms in 3 cities. Within 3 months, the version circulating through the martial arts community of the Western United States had inflated the 6 seconds into a minute-long exchange, had added injuries that didn't exist, had transformed Keller into a cartoon giant felled by a single miraculous blow. None of that was what happened. What happened was quieter, stranger, and more significant than the legend that replaced it. What happened was that a 310-pound man who had spent 15 years building an airtight case for why size and grappling would always defeat a smaller striker, sat down on his own mat and said, "Show me more." And Bruce Lee did. Ivan Keller modified his curriculum, not dramatically, not with the public announcement of a man who had changed his mind and needs people to know it. Quietly, internally, the way real learning happens, by incorporating new information into existing understanding rather than replacing one with the other.
He began teaching his students about distance management, about the danger of committing fully to a shot against an opponent who understood angles, about the nerve clusters that, if an opponent knew where they were, could interrupt the grip that was supposed to be the end of the conversation. He had learned these things on a Saturday morning in October from a man who weighed 175 pounds less than him. He taught them because they were true, and the truth in Keller's world was the only thing that mattered.
Bruce Lee wrote about grappling. Not extensively, it was not the center of his published philosophy, but in his private notes, in the annotations that fill the margins of his personal library, in the letters he sent to serious students who asked serious questions, he returned again and again to the problem that Keller had named so precisely. What happens when someone bigger gets hold of you? His answer was never simple. It was never the answer that people who wanted a shortcut were hoping for. It did not involve a secret technique or a forbidden strike or the magic of a particular system. It involved understanding. Understanding the geometry of your own body and your opponent's body so completely that you could feel, before it arrived, the moment the grip was coming, and respond not by fleeing from it, but by altering the conditions under which it would land, making the terrain unfamiliar, making the angle wrong, making the grip, when it arrive on a body that was not organized the way the gripper expected. He wrote, "The man who grabs at you has already decided what you are and where you will be. Be somewhere else. Be something else. Not by running, by being more present than he is, by understanding the moment he is committed to before he finishes committing to it." He wrote about size the way a physicist writes about gravity, as a real force, fully acknowledged, fully respected, and fully workable once you understood its rules rather than simply feared its weight. He never claimed that size didn't matter. He claimed that size was a variable, not a verdict. Ivan Keller lived until 1989. He ran his Inglewood gym until 1981, trained several hundred students over those years, and maintained, until the end, a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable grappling instructors on the West Coast. He spoke about Bruce Lee exactly once on record, in a brief interview with a regional martial arts publication in 1974, the year after Lee died. The interviewer asked if he had ever met him. Keller confirmed that he had. The interviewer asked what he thought of him. Keller was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He answered a question nobody else had been honest enough to ask. That's rarer than people think." The interviewer asked what the question was. Keller said, "What happens when you're wrong about what's possible?" He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. 135 pounds. That is the number people always lead with when they talk about Bruce Lee. The number that is supposed to explain why he shouldn't have been able to do what he did. The number that the men who underestimated him used as their primary evidence. He weighed 135 pounds. He did not move like 135 pounds. He did not think like 135 pounds. He did not prepare or train or study or push himself through the dark private hours of conditioning and research and refinement like a man who had accepted that 135 pounds was a limit rather than a starting point. The weight was real. The limit was not. And every man who walked into a room certain that the physics were on their side, certain that size and experience and the accumulated advantage of a larger body were enough, walked out of that room carrying a question they hadn't brought into it. Not why did I lose? Deeper than that. What else have I been wrong about? That question, planted quietly, without drama, in gyms and training halls and private demonstrations across 15 years, may be the most enduring thing Bruce Lee left behind. Not the films, not the philosophy, not the techniques, the question. the one that arrives the moment the grip fails, the moment the shot misses, the moment the mathematics you trusted completely return an answer you cannot account for. The moment 135 pounds sits you down on your own mat and offers you its hand. And you take it, because the only thing left to do, the only thing that makes any of the years of work mean anything, is to get back up and say, do it again. Show me what I don't know yet. Show me where my certainty ends and the real work begins. 6 seconds on a mat in Inglewood. That is all it took. 6 seconds to dismantle 15 years of absolute certainty about what the body could and could not do. 6 seconds that nobody filmed, nobody published, nobody authorized. 6 seconds that changed 2 men, one visibly, one invisibly, and sent ripples through a world that is still, if you know where to look, feeling them. If that story reached something in you, if you felt the moment the grip failed and understood what it meant, then you already know what Bruce Lee spent his life trying to teach. Not how to win, how to keep learning. Subscribe, because the next story goes somewhere nobody has looked before, into a room even smaller, a moment even quieter, and a truth that has been waiting 30 years for someone to tell it right.